Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Merci de continuer à suivre les conférences EnerGaïa. Titre de cette nouvelle table ronde, agrivoltaïsme, comment construire une filière crédible et durable.
Sustainable network. We see more and more files coming on the tables for agrivoltaism. Some are very solid, some less. The ADEME law and the legislative text have set the framework for agrivoltaism. However, some of them are still not well put together. So how can we promote this sector? By taking into account the diversity of the landscapes and what tools and what methods. We're going to discuss that with our speakers, and they all look at it in a different way, but it's all very complementary. So with us, we have the coordinator of the photovoltaic sector at ADEME, Céline Mel. ADEME, which after having worked in several pilot regions, has developed a qualification method for agrivoltaism projects, and they put in place a national observatory. Céline, you're going to explain to us where are we at with the current framework and how the tools by ADEME can help structure the network. And you'll present in detail those tools at 3:30. Our next speaker is going through a lot of files for the states. Pierre Giraud, he's in charge of energy transition, and he works at the Pole Renewables with the Aero department. So you're going to tell us how the state looks at this, what blocks, what helps, and all the points of vigilance. Then for this roundtable, we also asked the opinion of the project managers. So we have with us the representatives of Agrivoltaism, Cécile Magarini, sorry. She's also director of Sonagri, and also last, committed person on the environment. We welcome the agroclimatologist Serge Zaka, who's the president founder of AgroClimat 2015. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I'm now turn to the audience. You can ask your questions. We'll have a mic floating around at the end of the round table. You can already start by asking your question on the app. You can scan the QR code that will take you to the app, and you will be able to ask your questions there. And I will do my best to relay them. So we should start with a question, very simple question. We're going to wonder if agrivoltaism is a sector looking for credibility. That will be the first part of our roundtable. The second part will hear on how we can better support the development of the sector, what tools are available, and third, how can we anchor this network in the regions. We're going to start with an actor who sees a lot of files coming around, Pierre Giraud, who's in charge of energy transition at the DTM 34 in a region department such as yours, which sees a lot of contenders. What do you see coming up from all those files? Hello? Regarding the number of applications that go in the whole, for now, for renewables, for now we're at about 26 files, candidates, and this is a topic. Some sectors have very different results. We have two types. Generally speaking, we have the projects on vineyards and orchards, where we see small applications for 3 or 4 hectares maximum, or with solar panels that are here to address an issue that is generated by agriculture. This is a very important point that was set by the APER law. So we have the panels that address an issue on the impact of the solar on the leaves with this water stress, etc. So we can call it a real agrivoltaism because there is an added value on the agriculture, and this is proven. And then the second types of projects that we see coming by is pasture on the panels. And this is more different. It is on bigger areas, dozens of hectares, with this added value on the agriculture is not really proven in a Mediterranean climate because the areas of pasture in the Hérault department are poor soils, poor, very hot, very dry, and most of the evidence that are being brought are feedback from regions such as Beauce or Saône-et-Loire that have nothing to do with our Mediterranean climate. So rather than talking about the agrivoltaic sector, I would rather talk about the different agrivoltaic sectors, considering what I've just said. If you say that you receive a lot of projects that could work in other regions but less so in the Mediterranean climate, it means that you receive standard projects. Would you say that the developers have not fully understood the law that was very clear, the law on agrivoltaism? Is it your feeling? The prerequisite of the APR law is that the panels must bring a service to agriculture. This is the basis, and we have developers who have an opportunity to buy land, maybe, to get hold of land. And on some recognized sectors such as wine growing, fruit growing, we have good feedback in the region. On the pasture under the panels, it is much more up for debate. And the difference between a traditional PV park on the ground with the sheep and the agrivoltaism that should bring a service to the agriculture, they not fully understand what we're expecting from them, or is it the law that is confusing? Either it's a misunderstanding, either it's pure opportunism on their part. Okay, so Cécile Magherini, you're the head of France Agrivoltaism here, so we see more and more projects. Maybe there's confusion or opportunism. What do you tell yourself? Do you tell yourself, okay, we have a real issue, we should harness it and try to gain more credibility if we identify it? Or maybe we need to clarify the framework before we instruct the files? Credibility, I don't know. Trust, for sure. Credibility, this is why we got together at France Agrivoltaïsme to make sure that the agricultural world technicians and project managers can work together, and that's a very important point. There's a movement, there's a momentum. There's a time frame as well. The projects with Terre Agricole have started around 2020. There was no regulations in place at the time. In 2022, the first definition in a bill of law in the Senate, the regions took over the project. They said, we don't want solar in all the agricultural land. We want a reasoned proposal, and it's translated into decree of application in 2024 and the APR law in 2023. So between 22 and 24, we had a very long time to implement this regulation, and some projects were continuing at the same time. So if we look at the projects that we have today, all the projects, maybe at the exception of one, are projects that would not comply to the APR law. So what we have in mind is a project before the new regulation, and the projects that are present now are those who apply the law. But they were difficult to be managed locally. But we've also seen some project managers who wanted to save some projects who didn't fit in with the new regulations. So that's maybe the perception that the state offices have on that, of those who didn't, fit the bill, because they were initiated before this law. And what we say at Agrivoltaism is let us work with this within this APER law. And we have now a very precise framework with coverage rates, with levels of agricultural profitability that have to be respected. There are a lot of safeguards. And we want to make sure that this regulation exists, that the debate calms down, and we can finally show the references of the APER law. What are the levers, the priority levers, so the sector could grow? Is it about let you work and show the benefits of the real projects? Yes, I think that a lot of projects have a beautiful agronomic value. And there's also the debate of it hasn't been done in my region, it hasn't been done there. So what do you expect in terms of demonstration, and who's paying for this demonstration? And can we accept that between the Pyrénées-Orientales and the Aude departments, I'm exaggerating, of course, slightly, but an experiment in one place works for both. So we need a few demonstrators with third-party analysts. We're supposed to do some agronomic monitoring, and we need to analyze them, publish the results. Some project managers do it, and we need maybe an outside view on it, an outside experience on the results that we've gained, and that will help us with the credibility. We'll talk about the National Observatory of Agrivoltaism in a few minutes. But before, I wanted to hear out Céline Men from the ADEME, the technical instructions. Some people say that they have the feeling that they're navigating without any direction. Is the current work framework enough to secure this network that is growing? The regulatory framework is now set with the APER law. There's provision that is legal. It looks like what we proposed on the ADEME side in 2022, so we're happy about that. And this definition allows us to really have a clear idea of what we want to do with it. But as we heard, it is true that the implementation of this regulation and this definition remains very complex in the regions. We understand that we need to justify that it's benefiting the agronomy. We just have justify that we have a sustainable income that doesn't vary between and after the project. So those are very complex elements, and they require elements of information before, because we don't have those from the get-go. What we did on the ADEME side is we conducted a survey in 5 regions, including Occitania, so we can really put our finger on this operational reality. What we realized is that the justifications, and I'm talking about projects before APER or after the Loi APER, because we worked on all kinds of projects in agricultural land, the justification to back this definition of agrivoltaism are practically non-existent. There are many companies or developers who don't have enough step back on the impact of feedback on the of the agricultures on agriculture, and there's a diversity of climates as well, which means that the operational reality of the framework is quite complicated. What we also measured during the survey that lasted for quite a while, we worked for 12 to 18 months in the regions, is the challenge goes beyond the regulatory compliance. In regions, if I ask the question, is the project complying to the loi PER? But there's some other themes that are necessary and fundamental for the local actors. And here we're going to talk about consultation, landscape, environment, biodiversity, sharing the value. That are themes that are probably even stronger in those regions than the legal compliance. So we need to find this balance between justification, scientific justification that will back the regulatory framework, but also show the virtuous benefits of the project. In this survey, over those 5 regions, we counted 1,600 projects as various stages of development, whether they're already operating, or the projects that are still being designed, and that will have to be compliant to the APR law. They represent 17 gigawatts throughout these 16 projects. So it's quite a big number. It's quite a big volume that shows there's a big demand from the regions, and there's some mayors who feel that there's too many coming around and I don't have enough data, I don't know what to do with it. Please help. So that's the general feeling at the moment, and the ADEME is here to help the territories. That was the whole point of our survey that we're finalizing now, is to give tools to the whole sector to make the projects more credible, scientifically speaking, but also to ensure their sustainability. And so that's what decide if the project is adapted to the territory or not. So Serge Zaga, you're convinced by the agrivoltaism. How do you look at the beginnings of this sector, the sector that had a very good image? Do you fear that this image is going to be tarnished? I'm going to take yes, absolutely. I'm going to take an example which is different. I'm going to talk about AI. We built AI, which is interesting for the structure of proteins, vaccinations, the detection of cancers, etc. Very interesting. At its origin, as soon as it comes out of the head of the conceptor, the developer, is very interesting. But down the road, it's what we do with it that is not necessarily good. If you look at Facebook, social media, AI, what is it good at? Making kittens and porn. So 95% of the greenhouse gas from the AI are not useful. It's useful. It's white noise. For agrivoltaism, it's about the same. When it comes out of the head of a research center, it's very interesting. It helps fight against evapotranspiration, drops the temperature for the vegetables, fight against freezing, hail, and it also gives benefits on other aspects. So have some nets, irrigation structures, drips, etc. So technically, it is very interesting. But man is capable of produce many, many things to divert the scientific foundation of that to make profit out of it. So the legislation that is coming should say no, agrivoltaism is just an excuse to put solar panels on your land, on your agricultural land. It was supposed to be here to protect our crops. So if you look at the methanizer, sometimes if there's a drought, people are going to choose to put the corn in the methanizer because so it's a complete distortion of the concept. So the concept is interesting as long as we have the right safeguards. The safeguards are scientific study that should check that the profitability is guaranteed or even increased in context of climate change, because we want to make something sustainable. We're looking long term. If you take the Pyrénées-Orientales, there's some cases, I think it's Saint-Agri, where there's some solar panels that are very interesting in case of drought. But for now, we have not enough data and not enough feedback because it hasn't been going on for long enough. So the mayors have to decide. I have a white culture, there's no panels. I have the same culture, the same soil, and with the panels, I compare the evapotranspiration, quality of the wine, alcohol content, pH, and that's what we don't have at the moment. To bring acceptability, you need to prove things, and for now, we don't prove enough. We're still at the concept phase, and we have to avoid that this concept is diverted just for the excuse to get hold of land. So we need to remain scientific minded. We need to have modeling to measure the impact of this cover on the cultures that grow below. So we need to have those safeguards. I'm happy to have this legislation in place, and we need to keep a very scientific mind to make sure that the doesn't get lost in translation. So it leads us back to a question. I'm going to ask Cécile if she wants to react on it. How do you react to the statement saying that the agricultural projects are just an excuse that the developers have access to agricultural land or fallow lands? Well, at France Agrivoltaism, we can think all we want, but we have to prove the opposite, and that what matters is the results. What we want to do is protect the cultures, the meadows from climate change. So if we conducted a poll, 93% of the farmers in France are impacted by the climate change, and the average loss is 22%. And the topic of water resource, because this is a very big theme that agrivoltaism should address in terms of what it brings up the economy of water, and the impact of water restrictions on agriculture is very big. So the virtues of agrivoltaism are important. We should not belittle them. Do we look at the water half full or half empty? Some farmers are interested in the projects. They're motivated to cultivate under the panels, to act and not to be victims of climate change. It's a solution that is completely funded by the sale of electricity, so it ticks many boxes. It needs boundaries, a framework, and right now we have a technology that is mature enough, because we've had a lot of experiments done, so we have to be bold and show the results, show what works and show what doesn't work, to build a relationship of trust. It's easy because on the day and age of social media to do some bashing. It's easy to be against. But we have farmers who suffer from climate change and cannot afford protecting themselves. And that's a way to finance for them a solution to protect themselves from extreme heat, etc. So now we're going to get into the practical cases. We're going to see how we can help this development. What are the good practices? But before that, I wanted to ask Pierre Giraud, who treats the files, what are the watch-outs that come back regularly when you study a file, an application? Globally, I would say that there are two. The impact on the landscape, that comes back a lot, because if you imagine some structures that are 6 meters high in the landscape of vineyards and plain, it's obviously going to stand out. The Aero department is a very touristic department, and one of its assets is the beauty of the landscape. And the elected officials are starting to integrate the fact that the structures could, if they were to grow too quickly, too big, could change the looks and the potential attraction of the region. And we feel that they're starting to get involved in the conversation and start to think about how to what choice do we make? It's a choice of the local governments on a choice of landscape that is acceptable when you want to save the tourism. And they started working on that. The second point is the added value for the agriculture. At Pôle ENR, what we see as often is the farmer who's struggling, who he doesn't make enough money from his land, from his crops, and he can see it, and it's very understandably so, a little buffer so he can survive in this difficult environment that he lives in. So it has to be not only a financial revenue, and that it brings something more to an issue that they're facing themselves. So I would say, to answer your question, is the impact on the landscape that is often is not regulated by the law APER. And however, there are many files that go through our pole, our hub, and they are considered in protected areas in terms of landscape. We don't take into account the added value from an agriculture point of view because the impact on the landscape is too big. And then the project has to show that it addresses an agricultural issue. Thank you. Céline Mel, you work with ADEME, putting in place tools to help the sector to ramp up. Is it a common method that you're working on? Is it just a guide of good practices? Is it a qualification guide? The recommendation guide we published in 2022, when we did our first survey, we had already tried to push some good practices and recommendations for the actors of the sector. The study that we do now, the survey that we're finalizing now, is the operational part of the study. And so we went over to the next step. We're not looking at good practices, but a proper tool, how to define the agrivoltaic projects. The idea is on the basis of the first survey and all of the regulatory context that has happened since then. It was about adapting the first proposal that we had. So this tool is part of the regulatory framework, but it goes beyond, because the idea is to standardize some practices, because we see today that the territorial approach is fundamental to help the projects to be integrated well. So then we had to look at everything that exists in terms of guidelines, charters, documents published by local communities to see what criteria are important in the regions, to watch comparisons and similarities, and to retain most of these elements to come up with a qualification tool that would be universal. The idea is to have an homogeneous method, no matter what the region is, no matter what this PV structure, whether the agricultural production is. The goal is to really have a tool that can be used no matter what the situation is. And the other point is that we also have heard the operational expectations that we had in the region that showed that there's a need for a simple tool to qualify these famous projects. It is true that in the study that we started at the beginning, we were looking at something more exhaustive. It was a very big job. We wanted to change our approach, so we now propose some different approach. To propose two tools. One that is going to be very simple. Its use is going to be dedicated to people who are going to have to assess or analyze a project rapidly. So people who are working from the state or on the local community side, who have to look the project and give their opinion. So this tool will be very simple to use with some box to tick, yes, no, etc., to have a qualification very quickly. And then we'll have a tool that will be more complex and more exhaustive that will be more dedicated to project managers, engineering study, and it will be about improving the design of the project and showing all the challenges that need to be taken into account to justify if the project is serious.
Another question. Do you need to have a harmonization tool when agrivoltaism is supposed to be custom made? Is it useful to have this harmonization? We agree that in the territories there are very special specificities. The idea of harmonization consists in pinpointing the criteria that are common to all these territories and then to add the signature of a given territory. But the backbone for evaluating the project would remain the same. We talk about impact on the landscape. One territory may view a landscape as differently from another, so you can move the cursor in one direction or the other. However, in the methodology we have, the criterion remains the same, and you can filter projects in this way. Do we need to reaffirm the criteria which are indispensable to qualify an agrivoltaic project? The criteria which are indispensable, as we have said, that's the regulations, the APL law, the decrees, etc. That is the framework. But as we said earlier on, the goal of this tool is not to conduct a second sort of legal assessment. The purpose of the tool is to foster the deployment of this activity, to give credibility and durability. As you said earlier on, and I was very pleased to hear this live, the question is not, does the project comply? The question is the project virtuous, resilient? Is it desirable for my territory? And if the answer is no to these three questions, then even if it complies with the regulations, it will hard to win the support of the population, the neighbors, and so on. The purpose of the tool, therefore, is to deal with the regulatory aspect plus other criteria which make it possible to anticipate the risks involved. And one can say, careful, you may be asked questions. Have you dealt with the matter? If so, fine. And you can then provide these answers to the territories in question. Mr. Garine, how do you view these tools proposed by the ADEME? Do you think they are worthwhile when it comes to projects which can prove their agronomical worth? All the tools, in our eyes, are good. The greatest discussion we had recently concerned the quality of projects and their size. You have to find simple things which speak to people. So you have size. We're at a stage where there's a question of risk as well. What risk am I going to take if I don't attain the agronomical goals? What risk will I take in terms of the landscape? And that brings us to the question of size. Between 20 or 30 hectares, that would be the maximum size. And one can sense that acceptability goes hand in hand with the size and risk-taking. Currently, as representative of this activity, I say, well, I'd like to be able to do this, but you have to look at the price of energy versus the acceptability of the territory. There's a strong contradiction for us in this equation. In other words, things are hazy as to the PPE. Up until now, we had some fairly strong signals considering the auctions and the expected quality of agrivoltaic projects, and now we have a doubt. So we're happy to try to do everything, but the project holder finances the whole of the project. So it's free of charge for the farmer. Even if the farmer invests himself, it's necessary to have clear tariff signals that comply with the quality rules for projects. You talked about risk-taking, and there's an economic risk for the developer as well. Yes, there's an economic risk. That's why I think that quality will end up being regulated. Not long ago, we were at the DDT in the town, and they said, well, it's P9 under a certain voltage. I don't think any project holder currently could finance development up to the stage and spend 100,000 euros for the project not to follow through. Of course, there are appeals, but you're not going to go through a lengthy process necessarily. So I think it's a question of the quality of the project, but you have to think about the project 4 years after it's actually implemented. You have to think about the tariff that will be there. If you have no stability, no visibility when it comes to energy policy and the price of energy, it's going to be very complicated. Our fear is that we give the impression it's very complex. It creates something rather hazy in the territories. They're going to say, okay, it's not mature, it's not ready, let's just close the file and stop there. We regularly have had these warning signs of a moratorium. I'm in favor of quality. The problem is that you have to give us some visibility as to the price of energy. I have the impression that agrivoltaism in cattle herding is opportunistic and does not add value. That leads me to ask you a question. Cécile, could you talk to us about the most relevant projects that could be an example? Earlier on, you talked about projects that have to be highlighted. So tell us more about this matter. Well, the most relevant projects. Oh, Serge, go ahead. On cattle raising. Well, with animal husbandry, you have the question of fodder and also the heat stress for the animals. So small animals, for example, are one thing, and big animals another. When it comes to forestry, or rather peaches, fruit, market gardening, prices are very interesting. When it comes to grazing land, I find it a bit more complicated because the panels are much lower, the shade is more permanent, and I have a very serious doubt as to the durability of grass under the panels, because if the cattle or the animals then lie down under the panels, there won't be any grass, there won't be any fodder left. That's the problem I have. I think that we may have end up having sort of holes in the grass, in the plants, underneath the panels. I have another problem. Currently, with animals, there are fewer and fewer people who do animal husbandry. So in 20 years' time, will that farmer still be around, the one who has the panels? In 2 or 3 years' time, for example, maybe the price of electricity will have changed. It's very difficult also to raise animals, and maybe there will be no animals left under the panels. So you'll end up with all these panels, which were there to protect the animals, but the animals are no longer there. Well, I'd put the question to Cécile. What do you think about this for animal husbandry? We have an agrivoltaic offer for animal husbandry. Of course, our signature is moving panels. If you have mobile panels, you can work on prairie land, grassland. We've worked a lot on cattle and milk production. Will the panels change the quality of the milk? There have been all sorts of debates. The difference between a plant and an animal is that the animal can move around and go into the shade, whereas the plant can't move. So that's really the issue. So I think this should be done where there's real added value for the grassland. So we have projects for permanent grassland. That's the issue. And then when it comes to the big demonstration, we decided to start work on vineyards, perennial crops. It looked pretty obvious. These are crops with a lot of added value. We thought that should be the focus, because then we can put a price, €1, when it comes to the economic benefit. With fodder, it's hard to measure the added value, and that's one of the problems. You have to measure things, prove them. So we decided to look at vineyards, and quite frankly, the results surpassed our expectations because climate change is moving much faster than we had thought with our team of researchers. So last year in the Pyrénées-Orientales, we had 60% additional Chardonnay under the panels. In Biolinck, in the Vaucluse, we had the same quantity of wine under the panels as with the irrigation. So you have the issue of landscapes, granted. In the Rhone Valley, quite recently, people talked a lot about the AOC Côte-du-Rhône, which wants to ban agrivoltaism, basically because of the landscape issue and because of the sharing of value and the impact of agrivoltaism on land values. I would like to react to what was said by Mr. Zaka. Indeed, it's understandable for permanent meadowland when it comes to grazing under the panels. In the Hérault department, for example, when you file a project for agrivoltaism and animal husbandry, and animals, when it's hot, migrate, the animals won't be there during the hot periods. So what's the added value when it comes to animal welfare? The animal's not going to graze anymore because the 2 additional weeks of grass, if there are 2 additional weeks of grass, that's one thing, but you have this issue of grazing under panels, which truly raises great difficulties for us. In the Hérault, for example, the prefect, it's the renewable energies unit that decides about whether a file is worth it in terms of agrivoltaism. Grazing under solar panels has not received a stamp of approval for the time being. You have a law on agrivoltaism, and then you have people's feelings. And it's not just a question of agricultural production. As you said, the name Côte-du-Rhône, Côte-du-Rhône is dead against agrivoltaism, so it shows that this is a tricky topic. Now, let's go on to the next part and see how in the territories this line of activity could become a permanent feature. The National Observatory for Agrivoltaism is a very interesting and worthwhile tool. It's taking time to materialize. What is the main purpose and how might this observatory be useful when it comes to establishing agrivoltaism in the territories? The delay? No, the observatory is actually online, so it has officially been launched this very month. Well, last month, actually. So the observatory exists online with the data we have. We don't have enough data, however, today on agrivoltaism, according to the APER law. On the observatory site, you basically have pre-APER facilities. There's one facility that was authorized under the APER law, and there are also demonstrators and experiments. The purpose of the observatory is to meet the mission entrusted to us by the law, APER law. In the APER law, we got the mission of following agrivoltaic facilities from a statistical stance. We have to monitor this in all of the territories, and we're talking about the whole of France, not only continental France, but also the islands, the French islands. The idea is to centralize data. This was one of the big recommendations we got when the first study was done in 2022. We realized that sometimes data is centralized, but in a very local way or within agricultural institutes that work on a given crop. However, there was no global entity to centralize all the data. So that's our role and the role of the observatory, which will centralize regulatory data that's imposed according to the decree. You probably all know that a project owner has every year to give ADEME data on the project and must also monitor and send in reports at regular intervals. So we're going to use all this data. We also hope we'll be able to use voluntary data from research projects. We work with EnerGaïa and others. The goal is to accumulate data to produce indicators which reflect what works and what doesn't. Earlier on, we talked about a scientific approach, and that's exactly what our goal is. Of course, the goal of the observatory is to structure the whole of the activity. There is a governance which will be shared with all the stakeholders. We have various committees with the ministries, steering committees with the partners, and so on and so forth. And the goal is to structure this line of activity, to report on what we observe and our analyses, our scientific analyses, and bit by bit, we'll thus be able to support the government. Before asking for a reaction, I'd like to hear from Serge. You talked about the importance of data and scientific data. I think that what is most important is to accumulate the data year after year. You can look at the data over a year. We have a vineyard in the full sun and one under solar panels, but that's not enough data. You need to have 10, 15, 20 years to see how the vine is developing. You need to have a lot of past information. And by uniformizing this data, you can get a real view of the situation. Agrivoltaism can do a lot. Potentially, agrivoltaism may be very useful when it comes to wine growing. In other areas, say when you plant maize with agrivoltaism, we can really look at the scientific data. We need to cover a lot of years, however, and then we'll be able to justify the usefulness of agrivoltaism. Also, look at these little devices they use to combat hail. Nobody has ever proved that firing off these little sort of rocket devices is really useful. It costs the farmers a mint, but it may not serve any purpose. So we need, with agrivoltaism, to have a lot of data. It's quite simple to have experimental plans, and we should continue to do this. I have some information on the landscapes if you want to go any further. We can go back to that. We have a few minutes left. If you want to ask your questions, use Slido, and then perhaps the girls could come with the microphones to the front here, and if you want to react, you can raise your hand. We'll take your questions. Please use the microphone. I'd like to know what you have to say about the observatory. I'm very impatient. We also want data. In fact, I think we should focus on energy, on data, and analyzing the data. That's what people need in the field. That's what the services deciding on the projects need. That's what neighbors want when assessing a project. We have data, but we produce it. So we need to have an external view. The observatory exists, and if it has all this data, it's wonderful. Society is that way. Things can move fast now. But then you have regulations which take time to formulate. We're not all at the same level when it comes to results, and that's unfortunate. I think we now need to really focus on data and be very transparent, as I was saying, as to what works and what doesn't. Okay, do we have any questions in the room? I have one on slide 8. There's a gentleman over here. A very interesting question here. It's an important one. I'm flabbergasted by the negative views of agrivoltaism here expressed. It's just one view amongst others, but it's interesting to focus on all these comments. We're talking about a young activity. I seem to be answering the question in your stead. I wanted to give you an introduction. Well, I understand the question and the feeling behind it. It's exactly what you were saying, Olivier. We're talking about a young activity. We've talked about it for a couple of years, but it's still young. And we have very recent regulations which are only just beginning to be applied. So the feeling of almost everyone when you talk about agrivoltaism is, where's the data? Can you prove this works? Where do we stand? There's a promise which is huge. It holds out great promise, agrivoltaism. People want it to work. We can see that some things do work, but currently we're not certain that everything works. So the goal is to work on all the data, get this feedback, analyze the data, and then refocus on what works in order to ensure this activity develops. It's not negative at all. We're just waiting to be able to prove that everything works well. What about the herders who are developing agrivoltaism projects? I imagine you're 100% behind them. You have to be brief, though. Absolutely. In the survey, I said 61% of neighbors say they're in favor of agrivoltaism, and 50% of farmers view it as a real opportunity. And I repeat, the results we have so far are good. Plus 60% agricultural output, 50% water savings, etc. There's several forms of agrivoltaism. I think that's what we're in the process of saying at this conference. We need to have top-quality projects so that these beautiful projects that produce this kind of result become lasting over time. So it's good, but if we don't apply ourselves, then we'll end up with bad projects, and the whole activity will grind to a halt before we've been able to prove the results. So we have to think about the pace. We have to think about how we do things. We'll take your question. I'm a trainee at EDF, and I have a question about the expected results in animal husbandry. You talked about the results in the Mediterranean. They appear very relevant, but I have a question as to proof. Are you waiting for real demonstrators with animal husbandry in the Mediterranean, or on the contrary, are you waiting for studies more? Second question. When it comes to fodder, lucerne, or fodder for other animals, where do we stand? Lucerne, I was at France Lucerne just last week. To combat climate change, you don't just have solar panels on meadows, you also have the genetic diversity of the species present. Lucerne has much deeper roots which react to CO2, and they can withstand greater, higher temperatures, whereas wheat can withstand much lower temperatures only. And we have to view this in the Mediterranean context. We talked about agrivoltaism as a solution, but it's one of the solutions for meadows. You have trees as well, which provide shade, create a microclimate, manage evapotranspiration, wind, and lucerne is also very worthwhile. In other kinds of farming, market gardening, and vineyards, it's more complex to have trees. But in meadows, you have solutions used by the farmers rather than other possible solutions. Raise your hand if you have a question. We have a question for ADEME. Who are the partners on the developer side that you have included in the observatory committees? In the observatory committees, we have a partners committee where we have all the representatives of the unions and professional organizations. We can't have all the developers, of course, in the partners committee. What you need to note, however, as well, and as many of you may know, is that we will be setting up workshops where we'll broaden the horizons and question people who are much closer to the field, hence project holders, design offices, and will increase the range of stakeholders involved. In other words, there'll be a lot of consultation. Question for Serge. If you add agrivoltaism, is that a guarantee to ensure that these animal breeders, the people raising animals, will still be around 20 years hence, whereas they might have disappeared? This can help, but I think we have to look at the socioeconomic and political situation, because sometimes the payoff for raising animals is less and less. I don't think agrivoltaism itself can compensate for all this, because you'd have to have solar panels throughout the Larzac, for example. And in terms of the landscape, that's simply not possible. So it can be an asset for a couple of people, but that's not what's going to save animal husbandry. It's a way of stopping agri-bashing. It's a way of having local products in the canteens and in restaurants or even here. It goes quite far. Agrivoltaism is just a little piece of the puzzle. We have Bologna sausages just next door. In an optimistic version, we consider that agrivoltaism could cover 1% of farmland. That won't save animal husbandry. It's not the purpose. That's what I wanted to give by way of figures. Okay. There are a lot of solar panels on the sheds where you have animals. And that's not going to save animal husbandry. The sale of electricity won't suffice to set animal husbandry on a firm footing. Who did you consult to create this ADEME tool? You want names, in fact? Is that what you're looking for? I won't give any names here. We consulted several developers and the unions and various stakeholders, but not only on the energy side. We also consulted agricultural chambers, generators who help the local governments to put together agrivoltaic projects. We consulted an impressive range of people when it came to putting together the tools, the methodology, and testing the tools. The work spanned over 2 years. We did very in-depth work based on a lot of consultation. An interesting question. Do you have a vision? Do you have a vision of what is happening outside France? What is agrivoltaism elsewhere? We have an international section of agrivoltaism. There's agrivoltaism in Italy, where the auctions have been launched for advanced agrivoltaism. The results have been published. For the time being, Italy authorizes more farming loss than France. France authorizes 10%, Italy 20%. And when all is said and done, I think, but it's my personal view, I think that in Italy, the farming crisis is even more pronounced, particularly in the south of Italy. And above all, you can see all these solar projects where on big land holdings in Sicily, for example, hundreds of hectares. So these are ground-based solar projects. The price of energy is what prevails. That's why I wanted to insist on the price of energy. If we want to have all solar projects on the same level, I would refer to big projects on wide expanses of land. They want to forge ahead with advanced agrivoltaism, but it's complicated. You can use this in, well, you have regional policies, particularly in Emilia-Romagna. The area has said that the agrivoltaism project shouldn't cover more than 10% of the farm. That's a very small figure, but that's how they have chosen to protect themselves against the risk of a shortfall in agricultural production. There's a lot of agrivoltaism in Israel, where the impact of climate change is even greater. It's viewed as a means of creating energy autonomy and protecting crops. I'm referring to avocados, lemons, and other crops. Céline, ADEME, the economic reality of the project, was that taken into account when defining the other criteria which don't refer to regulations? Well, everything depends on what you're talking about. If we're talking about the simplified method, quite frankly, the additional criteria we added over and beyond the regulatory aspect, these criteria aren't very numerous, and they're not very binding. I didn't explain this, but I'll talk about it in the next workshop. When it comes to this stage-by-stage method, in the complete method, we have differentiated between 3 levels of progression. First level, well, the goal of all these different levels is that on the robust level, we have to look at the regulatory aspect with additional justification required. I'll try and simplify at this level, this robust level, level 2. Then we just show that we have identified what's at stake. We're not asking for studies which will cost thousands of euros. We just want to show that we're aware of what's at stake over and above regulations. And in the exemplary level, there we're not going to ask everyone to fulfill the requirements. We know full well that this level won't be filled in right away. The idea is simply to show that we have seen in the operational work in the regions that there are projects which have really good practices and are quite exemplary. So if you achieve this, then you get extra value. But we're not saying you don't have to do this. We say if you do conduct this kind of project, well, show it and make the most of it. So the goal here is to stand apart. So from an economic stance, no, we haven't done an economic study of our indicators, but quite frankly, I don't think that would force you to do much more work than you already do. Thank you. That brings us to the end of this roundtable. We've extended 3 minutes beyond our allotted time, and I think we can thank all our speakers. Thank you and congratulations. You can go to EOL at 3:30 for another workshop on agrivoltaism, and we'll have some of the same speakers. Thank you very much. And here at 3:30, we'll have a round table on innovation and land.